My husband had indeed returned. This time it was no fancy. "The key," said Genevieve. "It must go back on the ring with the others, as though nothing had happened." But the key was still caked with wet blood, and I ran to my bathroom and held it under the hot tap. Crimson water swirled around the basin, but as if the key itself were hurt, the bloody token stuck. The turquoise eyes of the dolphin tabs winked at me derisively. They knew my husband had been too clever for me. I scrubbed the stain with my nail brush, but still it would not budge. I thought how the car would be rolling quietly towards the closed courtyard gate. The more I scrubbed the key, the more vivid grew the stain. The bell in the gatehouse would jangle. The porter's drowsy son would push back the patchwork quilt, yawning, pull the shirt over his head, thrust his feet into his sabots. Slowly, slowly, open the door for your master as slowly as you can. And still the blood stain mocked the fresh water that spilled from the mouth of the leering dolphin. "You have no more time," says Genevieve. "He is here. I know it. I must stay with you." "You shall not," I said. "Go back to your room, now, please." He hesitated. I put an edge of steel in my voice, for I knew I must meet my lord alone. "Leave me." As soon as he'd gone, I dealt with the keys and went to my bedroom. The causeway was empty. Genevieve was correct. My husband had already entered the castle. I pulled the curtains close, stripped off my clothes, and pulled the bed curtain around me, as a pungent aroma of Russian leather assured me my husband was once again beside me. "Dearest!" With the most treacherous, lascivious tenderness, he kissed my eyes, and mimicking the new bride newly awakened, I flung my arms around him, for on my seeming acquiescence depended my salvation. "The silver of Rio outwitted me," he said wryly. "My New York agent telegraphed Le Havre and saved me a wasted journey. So we may resume our interrupted pleasures, my love." I did not believe one word of it. I knew I had behaved exactly according to his desires. Had he not bought me so that I should do so? I had been tricked into my own betrayal to that illimitable darkness whose source I had been compelled to seek in his absence, and now I had met that shadowed reality of his that came to life only in the presence of his own atrocities, and must pay the price of my new knowledge. The secret of Pandora's box. But he had given me the box himself, knowing that I must learn the secret. I had played a game in which every move was governed by a destiny as oppressive and omnipotent as himself, since that destiny was himself, and I had lost. Lost at that charade of innocence and vice in which he had engaged me. Lost as the victim loses to the executioner. His hand brushed my breast beneath the sheet. I strained my nerves, yet I could not help but flinch from the intimate touch, for it made me think of the piercing embrace of the Iron Maiden and of his lost lovers in the vault. When he saw my reluctance, his eyes veiled over, yet his appetite did not diminish. His tongue ran over red lips, already wet. Silent and mysterious, he moved away from me to draw off his jacket. He took the gold watch from his waistcoat and laid it on the dressing table like a good bourgeois. Scooped out his rattling loose change, and now, oh God, makes a great play of patting his pockets officially, puzzled lips pursed, searching for something that has been mislaid. Then turns to me with a ghastly triumphant smile. "But of course, I gave the keys to you." Your keys? Why, of course, they're here under the pillow. Wait a minute. What? No. Where can I have left them? I was whiling away the evening without you at the piano, I remember. Of course, the music room. Brusquely, he flung my negligee of antique lace onto the bed. Go and get them. Now? This moment? Can't it wait until morning, my darling? I forced myself to be seductive. I saw myself pale, pliant as a plant that begs to be trampled underfoot. A dozen vulnerable, appealing girls reflected in its many mirrors, and I saw how he almost failed to resist me. If he had come to me in bed, I would have strangled him then. But he half snarled. No, it won't wait. Now. The unearthly light of dawn filled the room. Had only one previous dawn broken upon me in that vile place? And there was nothing for it but to go and fetch the keys from the music stool and pray he would not examine them too closely. Pray to God his eyes would fail him, that he might be struck blind. When I came back to the bedroom carrying the bunch of keys that jangled at every step like a curious musical instrument, he was sitting on the bed in his immaculate shirt sleeves, his head sunk into his hands. And it seemed to me he was in despair. Strange. In spite of my fear of him, that made me whiter than my wrap. I felt there emanate from him at that moment a stench of absolute despair, rank and ghastly, as if the lilies that surrounded him had all at once begun to fester, or the Russian leather of his scent were reverting to the elements of flayed hide and excrement from which it was composed. The chthonic gravity of his presence exerted a tremendous pressure on the room, so that the blood pounded in my ears, as if we had been precipitated to the bottom of the sea, beneath the waves that pounded against the shore. I held my life in my hands amongst the keys, and in a moment would place it between his well-manicured fingers. The evidence of that bloody chamber had showed me I could expect no mercy. Yet, when he raised his head and stared at me with his blind, shuttered eyes, as though he did not recognize me, I felt a terrified pity for him, for this man who lived in such strange, secret places that if I loved him enough to follow him, I should have to die. The atrocious loneliness of that monster. The monocle had fallen from his face. His curling mane was disordered, as if he had run his hands through it in distraction. I saw how he had lost his impassivity and was now filled with suppressed excitement. The hand he stretched out for those counters of his game of love and death shook a little. The face that turned towards me contained a sombre delirium that seemed to me compounded of a ghastly, yes, shame, but also of a terrible, guilty joy, as he slowly ascertained how I had sinned. That telltale stain had resolved itself into a mark the shape and brilliance of the heart on a playing card. He disengaged the key from the ring and looked at it for a while, solitary, brooding. "It is the key that leads to the kingdom of the unimaginable," he said. His voice was low, and had in it the timbre of certain great cathedral organs that seem, when they are played, to be conversing with God. I could not restrain a sob. "Oh, my love, my little love, who brought me a white gift of music," he said, almost as if grieving. "My little love, you'll never know how much I hate daylight." Then he sharply ordered, "Kneel." I knelt before him, and he pressed the key lightly to my forehead and held it there for a moment. I felt a faint tingling of the skin, and when I involuntarily glanced at myself in the mirror, I saw the heart-shaped stain had transferred itself to my forehead, to the space between the eyebrows, like the cast mark of a Brahmin woman. or the mark of Cain. And now the key gleamed as freshly as if it had just been cut. He clipped it back on the ring, emitting that same heavy sigh as he'd done when I said that I would marry him. My virgin of the arpeggios, prepare yourself for martyrdom. What form shall it take? I said. Decapitation, he whispered, almost voluptuously. Go and bathe yourself. Put on that white dress you wore to hear Tristan, and the necklace that prefigures your end. And I shall take myself off to the armory, my dear, to sharpen my great-grandfather's ceremonial sword. The servants? We shall have absolute privacy for our last rites. I've already dismissed them. If you look out of your window, you can see them going to the mainland. It was now the full, pale light of morning. The weather was grey, indeterminate. The sea had an oily, sinister look, a gloomy day on which to die. Along the causeway I could see trooping every maid and scullion, every pot-boy and pan-scourer, valet, laundress and vassal who worked in that great house, most on foot, a few on bicycles. The faceless housekeeper trudged along with a great basket in which, I guessed, she'd stowed as much as she could ransack from the larder. The Marquis must have given the chauffeur leave to borrow the motor for the day, and it went last of all at a stately pace, as though the procession were a cortege, and the car already bore my coffin to the mainland for burial. But I knew no good Breton earth would cover me. Like a last faithful lover, I had another fate. I've given them all a day's holiday to celebrate our wedding, he said, and smiled. However hard I stared at the receding company, I could see no sign of Jean-Yves, our latest servant, hired but the preceding morning. Go, now. Bathe yourself. Dress yourself. The lustratory ritual and the ceremonial robing. After that, the sacrifice. Wait in the music room until I telephone for you. No, my dear. And he smiled as I started recalling the line was dead. One may call inside the castle just as much as one pleases, but outside, never. I scrubbed my forehead with the nail brush as I had scrubbed the key, but this red mark would not go away either, no matter what I did, and I knew I should wear it until I died, though that would not be long. Then I went to my dressing room and put on that white muslin shift. 12 young women combed out 12 listless sheaves of brown hair in the mirrors. Soon there would be none. The mass of lilies that surrounded me exhaled now, the odour of their withering. They looked like trumpets of the angels of death. On the dressing table, coiled like a snake about to strike, lay the ruby choker. Already almost lifeless, cold at heart, I descended the spiral staircase to the music room. But there, I found I had not been abandoned. I can be of some comfort to you, the boy said, though not much use. We pushed the piano stool in front of the open window so that, for as long as I could, I would be able to smell the ancient, reconciling smell of the sea that in time would cleanse everything, scour the old bones white, wash away all the stains. The last little chambermaid had trotted along the causeway long ago, and now the tide, faded as I, came tumbling in, the crisp wavelets splashing on the cold stones. You do not deserve this, he said. Who can say what I deserve or no? I said. I've done nothing, but that may be sufficient reason for condemning me. You disobeyed him, he said. That is sufficient reason for him to punish you. I only did what he knew I would. Like Eve, he said. The telephone rang, a shrill imperative. Let it ring. But my lover lifted me up and set me on my feet. I knew I must answer. The receiver felt heavy as earth. The courtyard. Immediately. My lover kissed me. He took my hand. He would come with me if I would lead him. Courage. When I thought of courage, I thought of my mother. And then I saw a muscle in my lover's face quiver. Hoofbeats, he said. I cast one last desperate glance from the window, and like a miracle, I saw a horse and a rider galloping at speed along the causeway, though the waves crashed now high as the horse's fetlocks. Her rider, her black skirts tucked up around her waist so that she could ride hard and fast, a crazy, magnificent horsewoman in widow's weeds. As the telephone rang again. Am I to wait all morning? Every moment, my mother drew nearer. She will be too late, Jean-Yves said, yet he could not restrain a note of hope that, though it must be so, yet it might not be so. The third call. You wicked woman! Do you wish me to compound my crimes by desecrating the marriage bed? So, I must go to the courtyard where my husband waited in his London tailored trousers and the shirt from Turnbull and Asa, beside the mounting block, with, in his hand, the sword with which his great father had presented to the little corporal, in token of surrender to the Republic before he shot himself. The heavy sword, unsheathed, grey as that November morning, sharp as childbirth, mortal. When my husband saw my companion, he observed, Let the blind lead the blind, eh? But does even a youth as besotted as you are think she was truly blind to her own desires when she took my ring? Give it me back, whore. The fires in the opal had all died down. I gladly slipped it from my finger, and even in that dolorous place, my heart was lighter for the lack of it. My husband took it lovingly, and lodged it on the tip of his little finger. It will serve me for 12 more fiancés, he said. To the block, woman. No, leave the boy. I shall deal with him later, utilising a less exalted instrument than the one with which I do my wife the honour of her immolation. But do not fear that in death you will be divided. Slowly, slowly. One foot over the other, I crossed the cobbles. The longer I dawdled over my execution, the more time it gave the avenging angel to descend. Don't loiter, girl. Do you think I shall lose appetite for the meal if you're going so long about serving it? No, I shall grow hungrier, more ravenous with each moment, more cruel. Run to me. Run. I have a place prepared for your exquisite corpse in my display of flesh. He raised the sword and cut bright segments from the air with it. But still I lingered, although my hopes, so recently raised, now began to flag. If she is not here by now, her horse must have stumbled on the causeway and plunged into the sea. One thing that only made me glad, that my lover would not see me die. My husband laid my branded forehead on the stone, and as he had done before, twisted my hair into a rope and drew it away from my neck. Such a pretty neck, he said, with what seemed to be a genuine retrospective tenderness, a neck like the stem of a young plant. I felt the silken bristle of his beard and the wet touch of his lips as they kissed my nape, and once again of my apparel I must retain only my gems. The sharp blade ripped my dress in two, and it fell from me. A little green moss growing in the crevices of the mountain block would be the last thing I should see in all of the world. The whiz of that heavy sword. And a great battering and pounding at the gate, the jangling of the bell, the frenzied neighing of a horse. The unholy silence of the place shattered in an instant. The blade did not descend. The necklace did not sever. My head did not roll. For an instant, the beast wavered in his stroke, a sufficient split second of astonished indecision to let me spring upright and dart to the assistance of my lover as he struggled sightlessly with the great bolts that kept her out. The Marquis stood transfixed, utterly dazed, at a loss. It must have been as if he had been watching his beloved Tristan for the 13th time, and Tristan stirred, then leapt from his bier in the last act, interposed from Verdi that bygones were bygones. Crying over spilt milk did nobody any good, and as for himself, he proposed to live happily ever after. The puppet master, open-mouthed, wide-eyed, impotent at the last, saw his dolls break free of their strings, abandon the rituals he had ordained for them since time began, and start to live for themselves. The king, aghast, witnesses the revolt of his pawns. You never saw such a wild thing as my mother, her hat seized by the winds and blown out to sea so that her hair was her white mane, her black lisle legs exposed to the thigh, her skirts tucked around her waist, one hand on the reins of the rearing horse while the other clapped my father's service revolver, and behind her the breakers of the savage, indifferent sea, like the witnesses of a furious justice. And my husband stood stock still, as if she'd been Medusa, the sword still raised over his head, as in those clockwork tableaux of Bluebeard that you see in glass cases at fairs. And then it was as though a curious child pushed his centime to the slot and set all in motion. The heavy, bearded figure roared out loud, braying with fury, and wielding the honourable sword as if it were a matter of death or glory, charged us, all three. On her 18th birthday, my mother had disposed of a man-eating tiger that had ravaged the villages of the hills north of Hanoi. Now, without a moment's hesitation, she raised my father's gun, took aim, and put a single, irreproachable bullet through my husband's head. We led a quiet life, the three of us. I inherited, of course, enormous wealth, but we have given most of it away to various charities. The castle is now a school for the blind, though I pray that the children who live there are not haunted by any sad ghosts looking for, crying for, the husband who will never return to the bloody chamber, the contents of which are buried or burnt, the door sealed. I felt I had a right to retain sufficient funds to start a little music school here on the outskirts of Paris, and we do well enough. Sometimes we can even afford to go to the opera, though never to sit in a box, of course. We know we are the source of many whisperings and much gossip, but the three of us know the truth of it, and mere chatter can never harm us. I can only bless what shall I call it? The maternal telepathy that set my mother running headlong from the telephone to the station after I'd called her that night. "I never heard you cry before," she said, by way of explanation. "Not when you were happy. And who ever cried because of gold bathtubs?" The night train, the one I had taken, she lay in her berth, sleepless as I had been. When she could not find a taxi at that lonely halt, she borrowed an old dobbin from a bemused farmer, for some internal urgency, told her that she must reach me before the incoming tide sealed me away from her forever. My poor old nurse, left scandalised at home. What? Interrupt my lord on his honeymoon? She died soon after. She'd taken so much secret pleasure in the fact that her little girl had become a marquise, and now here I was, scarcely a penny the richer, widowed at 17 in the most dubious circumstances, and busily engaged in setting up house with a piano tuner. Poor thing, she passed away in a sorry state of disillusion. But I do believe my mother loves him as much as I do. No paint nor powder, no matter how thick or white, can mask that red mark on my forehead. I am glad he cannot see it. Not for fear of his revulsion, since I know he sees me clearly with his heart, but because it spares my shame.